Good evening, fans. Tim Kitzrow here, the voice of NBA Jam, and you're listening to the Game Dev Breakdown Podcast, brought to you by CodeWritePlay.com. Whoa, boom shakalaka.
My mom gave birth in 1985. I was bluer than a Pac-Man ghost, barely alive. In the Cold War, my only blanket was Tetris. I played Rampart with Reagan, rampage the world for breakfast. The laundromat was my sanctuary, the arcade was my church. I thought I was Rastan, so for evil I was searched.
Hey, is this Blake?
Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing okay. How's it going?
It's good. Let me just tell my wife that I'm on the call. All right. What's your typical day like?
Well, so I'm blessed enough to work independently and for myself at the moment, so things mostly depend on who's watching my son. So, a lot of times I try to get stuff done with him running around, and that's awesome. Right now he's with his mom, and later in the week he'll be with my mother-in-law, which is also very nice. A lot of work gets done then.
That's awesome. How long have you been operating independently?
So I did professional commercial software development, non-games, for about close to 15 years, and I sort of went indie a couple of years ago, closer to when he was born. He's only 4 now.
Okay, cool.
I would love to get into a little bit about, I would like to get into sort of how you got to the place where you are, where you get to write these cool books and do all of this cool stuff. Definitely want to talk a little bit about each book and, you know, ideally what's in the future for you and where you want to go from here. That sound good?
All right. Yeah. I mean, just ask whatever you want, and I'm happy to answer.
So, first of all, thanks for doing this. I know you're super slammed schedule-wise.
No, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it.
And I want to ask, first of all, what was your education and early career like? I mean, how early did you know this was the kind of thing you wanted to do?
Ooh, the kind of thing I wanted to do, I knew pretty early. I would say that by the time I was in college, I went to school in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and I knew by my sophomore year that I wanted to be a writer, but I had no idea how to, do that professionally, how to monetize that, or even necessarily like what type of writing I wanted to do. I guess I should say at that point I wanted to write the great American novel,
sure,
sort of thing. And then out of college at 22, I started working. I got like a quote unquote day job, but it was a pretty intense day job. I was working at Rockefeller Center trading commodities for Brazilian clients.
Wow.
As a financial brokerage called FEMAT, and then was later renamed New Edge. And so basically one of the things I really liked about this job was that the market opened very early. This was before it went electronic, so it opened at like 7 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And then I would trade sugar, coffee, soybeans, and other soft commodity derivatives for my clients up until 2:15. And then, usually by 3:30 I was out the door and I could focus on writing for the rest of the day. So that was what I did to support myself, and then I ended up doing that for 8 years. And then all that while I was trying to figure out how to make a career writing. And at that point, throughout most of my 20s, I was focused on screenwriting. That seemed like the most feasible way to make a career out of writing.
Sure.
And I enjoyed it to an extent. I definitely enjoyed it. I just definitely didn't enjoy it as much as the stuff I do now. But I worked with my buddy Jonah Toulis, who I had gone to high school with, and we wrote a screenplay called The Flying Scissors, which was a 90-minute, like a 90-page mockumentary about competitive rock paper scissors. And then we decided to produce this movie ourselves. In hindsight, I still don't know whether it was a great idea or a terrible idea, but
I was wondering where the producing started.
Yeah, so, I had this job when I was making decent money. At that time, I was living at my grandmother's apartment in New York City because my grandfather had just passed away. So I was saving a lot of money, and I was saving that money for film school in my mind. And then Jonah and I had written this script that I thought was pretty funny. And he said, let's produce it. And he had, I felt like I had more of the writing experience and he had a lot more of the filmmaking experience. that over the years, since we still work together, that sort of merged. But, like I never would have came up with the idea to produce it. And at first I remember him saying like, oh, we'll each put in a few $1,000s. And I thought, okay, that's fine. That won't really mess up my plans to try to go to film school. But as a lot of these things probably happened, it became sort of a money pit. And I ended up putting all my money, like whatever, $40,000 or $50,000, everything I'd saved over the first 2 years for film school. I ended up putting that into this movie. And that, like I said, I don't know if it was a terrible idea or a great idea. It doesn't have a super happy ending, but obviously I learned a lot doing it. And then that's really where the producing started.
Yeah, if you didn't envision yourself heading off to Hollywood forever, yeah, I can understand why that would seem like a rough way to lose your resources at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that too did, I think it's unsurprising, but it bled into the project itself. Like I still to this day think that project was pretty fun. As silly as it's a very silly idea, but at least I think we did it pretty well. And but for a while there, I sort of hated the project because it was a thing that I took all this money and took all this stress, and we got rejected from every film festival we applied to. So it was like this very negative thing in our lives. But then after a couple of years, I do feel like we were able to get some distance from it and actually try to look at it a little bit more objectively. And that was helpful because what we decided was that there was a pretty fun movie here. It was not, like The Godfather, but it was a good, silly movie. And I thought, who would like this? Probably college students. At that point, I wasn't too far out of college, so I contacted Georgetown, like the committee that, puts the student activity committee, and asked if they would have any interest in screening the movie, and they did. And then I thought, other schools might be interested in this too. So I ended up contacting, I think, 500 schools, and I think 42 of them said yes. So we got a little college tour out of it, and that was probably the most important lesson that I learned out of it, was just contacting people and getting used to being rejected.
Yeah.
Because what is that, like 458 people said no, but that was fine because 42 people said yes. And I know that might sound like a silly thing, but I do think that was a big deal. Like, I think a lot of people are afraid to put themselves out there, and I certainly was. I hated being rejected, but I got very okay with it as long as it was in the greater service of a project. So that would end up serving me very well with my future book projects because, trying to get people for interviews, especially when you have no track record, is not the easiest thing. But as long as I was getting some yeses, I didn't really care how many no's I got.
Yeah, hearing the word no as a creative person is so difficult, and gaining the ability to do so is so crucial. And also, what I learned in freelance writing was hearing nothing at all. That was the one that really set me off. I was like, somebody could say something,
Right. Well, yeah, it's a really important distinction. I was actually thinking about that after I made my comment, because half of it is no, and half of it is just never hearing back, and then trying to figure out, should I bug this person again? And then, how to interpret silence, and obviously it's kind of annoying. But yeah, I mean, it's not like 450 people said no. I bet probably half of them said no, and half of them never said anything and never replied to my follow-ups, and maybe I didn't even know if I was contacting the right people. But yeah, you're right. That's a big part of it. It's just the no response.
And speaking of freelance writing, when does that kind of work start for you, and who have you gotten to do it for?
So what happened was I wrote a screenplay with my friend I mentioned earlier, Jonah. It was called The Sordid Tales of an Evil Tyrannical Ex-Dictator. It was a comedy. It was about the dictator of a small European country, wealthy country, sort of, we imagine like a Ricky Gervais type dictator. And he gets overthrown, and then he ends up going into like the witness protection program in the United States, and ends up working at the DMV in New Jersey until his life catches up with him. It was very much like an homage to Coming to America and Trading Places and movies like that from the 80s.
Sure.
And then this was sort of the script that we thought was going to break our careers, and this one was a very good script. I think it was the best one that I've ever written. And then a week or so after we finished writing it, Sacha Baron Cohen announced that he was doing a movie called The Dictator. And at that point, like, you know, Sacha Baron Cohen had no script or anything like that. It was just an idea. But our script was like instantly worthless. And that was very frustrating, but also like educational, because if I put myself in the shoes of a movie studio head, I would much rather have like an idea from Sacha Baron Cohen than like a 90-page script from me and Jonah, even if it was a very good script. So like I kind of understood, as frustrating as it was, I wasn't like, oh, this is so stupid. I understood why his script would be, or his potential script would be more valuable. But that was like definitely like a rock bottom sort of experience. And out of that, I still had my day job, and I sort of realized that I was going to always just keep writing, and I was probably going to have to, my day job was probably going to have to become my real job, or at least I'd have to try to find a different job. I probably wasn't going to make a living writing, I was thinking. And so I decided that, whatever I work on going forward, it should be a project that I really, really love, because I'm probably not going to make any money doing it. And then that's what led me to writing Console Wars. And, obviously the wonderful irony, that was a project that I finally made money on and really did help launch my career. So that's how I got into writing nonfiction. I had never written any freelance pieces beforehand, which certainly, probably caused trepidation for my publisher and my editor, having never seen anything I've written before. In terms of articles, because I did end up writing a very long and comprehensive book proposal because I had no bylines anywhere. But that was really how I got into it.
Okay, so it was basically just a fantastic pitch. That was to HarperCollins, is that right?
Yeah, it was to HarperCollins, and I should also mention that it was like I spent about a year. Basically, we sold the proposal over a year after I had been working with it. So it wasn't just like I came up with this idea and then I wrote up a good pitch. Like, it was very much a labor of love, to the extent that I guess, by the time, I'm trying to think back exactly, but in January of 2012 was the first time that I met Seth Rogen about the project, or, first time I ever met Seth Rogen. Prior to that, I guess for like 6 months, I had been interviewing people and putting together not a formal proposal, but just sort of like an overview of the project. And then that was what I asked my manager to send to Seth's company. And I never had any expectation that I would hear back from Seth's company, let alone Seth, because they're very famous and a big deal, and I'm not. And so that was like a really big turning point when they were interested in meeting. And then, so that happened in January of 2012. At that point, I think I had interviewed like between 50 and 100 people. And then over the next year, I continued interviewing people. And so the book proposal went out in November of 2012. And, like I said, it was a comprehensive proposal. I think I included like 5 or 6 chapters. I had outlined the whole book. I had listed the 100, or at that point, maybe 200, I don't know, all the people I interviewed and had relationships with. I, was able to quit my job and write full time after that. That was a really big moment. I remember getting a phone call from my agent and manager while I was at my day job, and I stepped outside and they gave me the great news that I was going to be able to quit my job and work on this.
Wow, you did way more of the work for that book before you had the go-ahead than I thought. You were neck deep in that project.
Yeah. In my case, I felt like I had to be. I mean, I kind of did, because obviously having the endorsement, or basically that Seth was going to write the forward, and more importantly that he was going to make the movie, was a big part of it, and that only happened because of all the legwork that I did. I think that when I first met with Seth in 2012, half of the appeal, or more than half of the appeal, was the story itself, of course, that I could sit there for 2 hours and tell him how this was like the social network of video games. But part of it too was, why does he even need to involve me? And it was because I had these connections with all these people, and I knew all the people to speak with. So I had done a lot of the legwork, and then also it was because I didn't have bylines at magazines or game sites. So I really did need to prove myself that I could write, because, I was asking people to give me money, and then I would go off and write. So yeah, that was what I did. I always still find it surprising that despite what I think was a pretty awesome book proposal, and despite having people involved in the project like Seth Rogen and Scott Rudin that were way more famous and successful than I was, I think we sent it out to 25 publishers, and 22 of them passed on the book because they said video game books don't sell, which I thought was just crazy, because part of the reason I wanted to write this book was because there's so few video game books. And so that's always something I think about, because I hope that there will be more and more video game books over the years, and that I hope my books have helped make it easier for someone else in my position going forward.
I hope so too, because obviously Console Wars is fantastic reading for readers that aren't familiar already. Console Wars tells the story of basically Nintendo versus Sega in the 90s, and sort of what brought us back from the video game crash and built up to sort of the modern game industry. And it mostly features people from, interview-wise, it features a lot of people from Sega. Is that mostly right?
Yeah. And like I said, I offhandedly mentioned that it was like the social network of video games, and this really is sort of a behind-the-scenes story focused on the business people at these companies, even more so than the game designers, that's still part of the book. But yeah, it's like the story of how Sega went from less than 5% of the market to surpassing Nintendo, which basically had a monopoly, and it was more focused on Sega than on Nintendo, which initially maybe was not the plan, but that's where I thought the more interesting story was, and it was also very hard to get access to Nintendo people, so it kind of worked out nicely that I had more access to Sega people, and that was, to me, the more dramatic story, because they were the underdogs.
Having read the book, I agree. It was such a fascinating thing, because so many of us have heard a lot of the sort of a little bit of behind-the-scenes stuff from Nintendo, and given the choice, I think a lot of people would have said, I would kind of like to hear that Sega side, and it turned out the story behind that was just as compelling as anybody could have hoped, and probably more so. And what I love is that these guys are largely still around Twitter and social media, and they still talk about this stuff like it's still going on, and they all love it.
No, I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, the Twitter stuff is awesome as well, but just the fact that, for a guy who had never really written nonfiction before, and who had I'd never really interviewed people before, I didn't know what to expect. And as much as I, view myself as an objective journalist and storyteller, I also was a kid who grew up during the battle between Sega and Nintendo, and I have like an emotional, attachment to that era. And so I was kind of nervous going into the book that I would speak with people from Sega and Nintendo, and that they would sort of, I would look back on this time very fondly, and that they would just sort of say like, oh yeah, that was just like any other job, punching the time card. And it would sort of be deflating, because I imagined it was like working at, Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and they were just going to say, oh no, it was just not that impressive. But I will say that like almost every single person I spoke with, especially the core people who are featured heavily in the book, they all look back on that time as, one of the fondest in their lives. So that made it a lot more fun for me to work on, that it was such an exciting time, and that, like you're saying, like even nowadays, 25, 30 years later, they're still, happy to talk about this time period and still sort of step into that era. So that was a really enjoyable part of the process.
Yeah, after reading the book, I went to Twitter and found several of these guys just to follow along and see sort of how their life was now. And if you go find Al Nilsson, for example, he still talks like this is all actively going on. Like he is 100% enthusiasm about this stuff and would talk about it nonstop, which I love. And I actually get to interact with Ed Annunziata of Echo the Dolphin fame, and he's a really fun guy to know on social media.
Yeah, no, Ed's an awesome guy. Ed's a good example of the developer perspective. He has such a beautiful story, such a passionate story about how he came up with Echo the Dolphin, and that was also part of the joy for me of writing this. Not to say that making games today is less joyful or less joyful to write about. Sure. But back then, because games, cost $500 million, $1 million to make, and because they were usually small 1, 2, or 3 man teams. Like they were, much more visionary sort of products because you could take that gamble and because, you only had a few people working on it. So, with Ed leading Echo the Dolphin, very much his vision. And in that case, I think it worked out well. And in other cases, maybe it didn't work out so well. But as an artist myself and yourself, I'm sure that you appreciate, sort of like auteur projects, like, ones that are like a little bit out there and very much exactly how the creators want. And then you don't see that as much anymore for a lot of understandable reasons. But I did like that a lot about that era of gaming.
Absolutely. And so now that the book has been out, it was very successful. And now that the story is in the hands of Seth Rogen, where are we at with, did it move to becoming a series now? Where are we at?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. So when I mentioned that Seth Rogen was involved back in 2012, what had happened was he had a deal with Sony, and we ended up selling the film rights to Sony to do a movie. And then over the years, we decided that we thought it would be better as a television series. And when the rights returned to me after the Sony deal, and Seth still very much wanted to be involved and doing it as a series, so we ended up bringing it to Legendary Pictures, and we finished a deal with them last summer. And right now we are in the process of negotiating, or I guess meeting with, and then eventually negotiating with distributors to figure out, where the show will be produced and aired. And we should know that probably early this summer. And so we have a pilot script that was written by Mike Rizzolio, our writer, and he's awesome. It's kind of surreal to read a pilot script based on your book, and also again, like from one artist to another. Like I'm sure you can understand how that'd be like a little bit weird because it's like, my story, but it's also not even my story. It's a true story, and then it's got, Mike's story, but I couldn't be happier with what he turned out. And I swear I'm not just saying that, like it's really an amazing job. I feel like it has his voice, but it also has my voice in there too. But more so, I feel like it authentically captures the story, which I feel like I did, or at least that was always my goal.
It's going to be so much fun to watch, especially for anybody who's read the book and sort of followed along with your career. I think that's going to be a really awesome thing to see go live wherever it does. That's going to be cool.
Thank you.
So at this point, now when and how do you decide to go from here to tell the story of basically the past and present of virtual reality?
Oh, what a decision that was. Which was, we'll get into in a moment why it turned out very different than I expected, though I'm obviously very happy that I made that decision. So Console Wars came out in May of 2014, and at that point, I distinctly remember having a conversation with my manager and saying that I thought it was pretty sad I would never write a book as good as Console Wars, and he said, "Oh no, you'll keep getting better at writing," and I said, "Yes, but I don't think I'm ever going to find a book that's as culturally important, as interesting, and has so many larger-than-life characters, and such an intersection of technology and pop culture and business and all these things."
Sure.
And I guess it will remain to be seen whether the new book, History of the Future, is considered among those ranks. I definitely think that the book turned out as well as Console Wars. So, but so what happened was, around that time, I guess initially I was planning to maybe write a book about electronic arts. The early years of EA especially were very fascinating to me, and also I'm a big sports gaming fan, so EA Sports was very fascinating to me. I was also considering maybe writing a book about Rovio, the makers of Angry Birds, and but then during that time I ended up trying one of Oculus's DK1 headsets at the E3 trade show. And I was really just blown away by virtual reality. And, it wasn't like I immediately thought, oh, I'm going to write a book about VR, but it made me very interested in VR. And for any of the writing I do, I really do need to have very strong access to tell the kinds of stories that I want to tell. Sure. Because to me, as is obvious from both of my books or anything I've written, I really just love character-driven stories. I often talk about how everything I write, I want to make sure that my grandmother could enjoy. So I need to figure out a hook into the story beyond just the technology or beyond the content itself. And then learning about Palmer Luckey and the founding of Oculus and how he was this 19-year-old kid back in 2012 and how he founded this company, and then how less than 2 years later they sold to Facebook for $3 billion. And then all of that combined with my own personal passion for virtual reality really made for a good combination. But like I said, access is usually important, and for me it's critical. And so it took me like a year and a half to get the access I wanted from Oculus and Facebook, which started in February of 2016, 1 month before the launch of their first consumer product, the Oculus Rift. And so at that point, they were about to launch this product that they believed was going to change gaming forever. I think we can all agree it didn't. Not yet, though their new headset, Oculus Quest, is awesome. But anyway, needless to say, the launch, that whole year from a business standpoint was not what Oculus expected. And then from a personnel standpoint, it was definitely not what they expected. And midway through my writing the book, Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus, got fired. And so that turned into a whole other thing. So interesting in a lot of ways, this new book. But I think, one of the most obvious was just the difference between writing a book about something that happened 20 years ago and a book about something that was happening as I was writing it. And of course, it turned out very different than I would have expected, but it was already just a challenge in general to keep up with the, ongoing virtual reality news before any of that stuff happened.
Right. And it's funny because you get so deep in your projects, and that definitely comes out in your reading. I mean, you were just right in there as if you had gone back in a time machine and captured what happened around you.
Thank you.
And so when I heard that basically you were in the middle of it when Palmer Luckey did get dismissed, I thought, oh my God, that must be rocking his world as he works on this project, because you are in the middle of it, and you have I'm sure at that point you have access to all kinds of people, and we're hearing about controversial stuff in the news a while back, and you're seeing it right in your face. So, I mean, how did you even get through that to finish the book at that point?
I mean, just hearing you ask the question brings back a lot of memories and raw emotion. The honest answer is just that I had to. And also, and I will also say that, I've been asked over the years if I have any interest in writing fiction or going back to writing fiction and screenplays. And of course, as a storyteller, I'm always interested in a good story. But I often tell people that I don't think I could finish a fiction project anymore, because having worked in nonfiction and, dealing with real people, and, I feel like an obligation to them to finish the work. And I think that's a large part of the answer to your question is, to me, Palmer Luckey wasn't just like a character in media articles. He was like someone who I knew very well, and I knew what he was going through, and I knew, and I believed it, or I didn't know, I believed it was very important to get the true story out there. I also saw the other side of what was being reported, just for listeners to somewhat understand what we're talking about. So in September of 2016, September 22nd, 2016, this was like 6 months before, this was like 6 weeks before the U.S. presidential election here. An article came out with the headline talking about Palmer, and the headline was "Facebook Billionaire Secretly Funding Trump's Meme Machine." And the insinuation was that so many of the terrible memes that you had seen online over the past election season, particularly like the racist memes, the hateful memes, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, all that stuff, that Palmer Luckey was funding a group that was producing these memes. And that turned out to not be true at all. But what was true was that Palmer was, and I believe still is, a Donald Trump supporter. The story was misreported over and over the course of 24 and 48 hours. And like you said, I had a front row seat to this. There was, articles that was, basically Palmer Luckey was no longer seen at events, and he was kind of, he was always a very frequent social media user, and he didn't say anything publicly for several months, but I was talking to him every day, so I knew exactly what was going on. And it's like, or I shouldn't say exactly, because there were certain things that he couldn't talk to me about for, I later came to realize, legal reasons. But I had a very good idea of what was going on in his life and what he was going through, and what had actually happened. And so it was a unique experience. And then I would say that I was probably as surprised as he was that he ended up getting fired as a result of all of this. And it was a very, I think it was a sad thing, because it had the reasons why he was fired. Well, first of all, when he was fired, they never said he was fired. They said that he exited the company, and because Palmer was legally not allowed to say anything otherwise, there was just sort of this weird situation where, it wasn't like he resigned, and it wasn't like he was fired, apparently. So that was kind of odd. But, it was sad that his dismissal had nothing to do with the virtual reality or with business, well, at least with the business of technology. They might make a claim that his political affiliation disrupted business. I think that's pretty obviously not true. But yeah, it was not what I expected the book to be. It was also, I admit, challenging for me because, like I said, Palmer was, and I believe still is, a Trump supporter, and I'm very much not a Trump supporter. But my job was to accurately report what happened. So, I guess some people see my reporting as being sympathetic to him. And I guess, I don't know if sympathetic is the right word, but it definitely was correcting an inaccurate story that I think at the end of the day, a lot of people in the media thought that Palmer being a Trump supporter was a crime in itself. And I had to report it in a way where that was not the case. And nor do I believe that's the case. I don't think that supporting a candidate that I dislike, even as strongly as Trump, makes you a bad person. I think everyone has their own reasons for supporting a candidate, and most of them are pretty valid and understandable.
Mm-hmm. And part of what makes this so interesting as a result is that the history of the future really starts with the story of Palmer Luckey almost since childhood, and certainly his formative years. And so you sort of get invested in his story just as a byproduct of reading the book, and to see such a fantastic technical story take off, and then to be in the middle of this while he's basically dismissed over, like you said, the support of one candidate over another, certainly at a time when I don't think a lot of the nation really knew as much about either candidate as we thought, certainly compared to now. It's tough to see that happen, and it's also tough to see it as a result, what I would say seems as a result of Facebook acquiring Oculus. I don't know that would have gone the same way had that not taken place. You tell me. Right.
No, I mean, these are really, I'm really glad that you are saying that. I'm glad that you interpret it that way, and I think that also goes back to your question of how was I able to get through it, and it was in part because I knew Palmer really well. I have very complex feelings about him, positive and negative, but he was always a good source to work with, whatever, as long as he was legally allowed to talk about something, he was always very honest with me, and I appreciated that. And so part of the reason that I was so committed to doing this and why I ended up taking an additional 2 years to finish the book was because I like I said, I know the people involved. I thought it was really important to get the story accurate. And then also, like what you're saying, have you ever seen the movie $1 Million Baby by chance?
Yeah.
So that was kind of how I envisioned this, where, spoiler alert for the next 20 seconds for anyone who hasn't seen $1 Million Baby, but, it's a movie that for the first 90% was about female boxing, and the last 10% after Hilary Swank's character gets injured, it's about euthanasia and the right to end one's own life. And like what you were saying, it starts off as one story and it becomes something else. And to me, that was a really great way to explore political discrimination in Silicon Valley and just the national sentiment about Trump, or at least with the, how liberals felt about Trump, myself generally included, because it was not what the book was actually about. You walked into it in this very organic way, and I feel like it gives you, it's a chance to actually explore these things with a much more open mind than if I said, hey, let me tell you a story about a Trump supporter who was treated unfairly. Most people who don't like Trump would just sort of roll their eyes. And I honestly probably would have done the same had I not reported on this book. But, like you were saying, obviously the Facebook acquisition did change things a lot. but whether or not this would have played out the same way, whether Oculus had been acquired, I think it's easy to say it wouldn't, but I kind of think it would have, because I kind of just feel like the sentiment that got Palmer fired was a very much just a general Silicon Valley bubble sentiment. So I should caveat and say that Oculus was located in Southern California, so they weren't actually located in Silicon Valley. But I still feel like it was kind of indicative of the fact. I remember in the aftermath of those articles about Palmer in September 2016, people were asking developers if they were still going to develop for Oculus. And I think, some of them put out some non-committal sort of press statements explaining that they were committed to diversity and things that were seemingly unrelated to this. But the fact that they felt compelled to put out statements is a sign to me that this was going to be the fallout would probably be similar, whether it was Silicon Valley proper or whether it was just going to be a general tech gaming thing. And I always found it really kind of awesome. I mean, awesome in a sad way, because this whole thing to me is very sad. It's it's really just a failure of the media, in my opinion. And also, like I said, a tale of political discrimination, which in this case was sort of, discriminating against people who are not like me, but I still find that to be morally wrong. But the funny thing to me is that one of the two or three game developers, I guess it was three, the night that this happened, three small game developers said that they were not going to produce content for Oculus until Palmer was fired. One of those companies, the first one I believe, was Scruda Games. I'm not sure whether Scruda Games has ever ended up producing a game in virtual reality. I don't know if they made a game or not, but I really admired the fact that a week after this happened, they publicly reversed their position, because they realized, as I did doing my research, that what was reported was not true. They said that there was no memes and that it looked like it was just one billboard. And I really admire that, because, to me, that should be a commonplace thing. If you're wrong about something, you should admit it and change your mind. But the fact that Scruda Games was willing to do that, but that no one in the media, even to this day, I guess a couple of sites have, but like the ones who reported the story and who created this false narrative, they should be the ones to either apologize or at least correct their position, and they still haven't. So I really admire this small indie developer for, at least having the integrity to admit that they were wrong or that they had been misled.
I think that's exactly the right sentiment, because like you say, I saw a lot of major outlets cover this stuff, and it seemed very different from what I came away with in interactions with you and looking at the material in the book. And as a fairly independent person, and that's easier some days than others, but I certainly have this desire to see basically the truth win out and let people decide on issues based on what's actually happening, and they can't do that if no one's willing to tell the full story. And so I think that people like yourself at the forefront of this, albeit perhaps unintentionally, and
right,
being willing to suspend your own natural instincts about an issue to make sure that we all hear everything that we need to hear. I think that's crucial. And for that reason, I think you were the right person to be there at the right time. It actually struck the same kind of chord with me that I felt when I heard Joe Rogan talking to Tim Pool, for example, about the Twitter management. I don't know if you saw that whole thing recently, but it seemed like it was a very similar thing. Tim Pool claiming to be a long-standing liberal guy, independent journalist, and he run into his own problems with Twitter, and then Twitter saying we don't have a bias and we treat everyone the same, and coming up with example after example of Twitter not treating people the same, and them going either they're allowing something according to their own bias to happen and saying, oh, hey, we don't get it right all the time. Or if someone brings up an opposing viewpoint, they go, no, that was targeted harassment and a clear violation of our terms. And it's just this very different narrative you can sort of flip on and off like a switch. But I think this is what we need. These people sort of clinging to objectivity and saying, here's what's actually going on. Now let's decide whether or not we want things to go this way.
Yeah, I mean, I followed loosely with the Tim Pool stuff, and then I also saw that, Jack Dorsey was on Joe's show a couple times. I think once with Tim there. So I haven't listened to all the hours, but I'm somewhat familiar with the situation.
It is like a 5-hour show to your credit.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this is what happened. This is how the story played out. So I'm sure that I have a vested interest in convincing myself that I'm glad that I was the one who was there, or that at least, even though this wasn't what I wanted to happen, at least the silver lining is that I feel like I got to report on accurately. But what you're saying about you just want like an objective voice, and I'm sure that honestly there were seemingly subjective conservative voices that probably had some good objective points that maybe people like you and I were not listening to. But then when it came from people like Tim Pool and I, who actually might have a subjective liberal perspective, and we're saying these things, then it does get more people to notice that there is a problem, and there is a problem. There's very obviously a problem. I mean, for me, one of the moments when I started to realize it was a very non-dramatic moment, but it was like me just talking with someone on Twitter, and they were, a hardcore Democrat, and I asked them what position, and they were talking about how, Republicans are evil and have all these evil positions. And then I said, all right, well, just name one position that conservatives or Republicans have that you disagree with, or maybe you agree with, whatever. Name one position that you might not like, but that you will acknowledge is like not evil and not wrong. And they couldn't come up with anything, and that's so crazy because it should be like almost all of them. Like I'm pro-choice, but I understand, I believe, like why someone would be pro-life. I would maybe try to persuade them otherwise, but I don't think they're wrong. I think I might be wrong. Who knows? But to think that like every position that one side holds is actually wrong and detrimental and evil, it's a lot easier to understand the mindset of why you would discriminate against that side, because you actually think that you're fighting the good fight. But you know what? That's exactly how the other side thinks. So you can't do that. You can't just assume that your side is correct and then, use that as a license to discriminate against and say that, you're not discriminating against because you're just doing the right thing. So it's a real problem. I'm not an expert on this, so this is like purely just anecdotal, but it does seem like Twitter actually handles it better than Facebook, in my opinion. Like, at least I admired that Jack went on Joe's show, even if he had a lawyer there and couldn't answer a ton of questions. But like, I feel like Twitter's trying to learn and trying to get better, whereas Facebook has clamped down in a way that I find really discouraging.
I think I would agree with that. And what stands out to me is that despite all of these, this sort of hard turn your experience went with writing this book, I still do think that the story of like the rise and prominence of VR was captured very well in the history of the future. and I know the right people are going to see that and get exactly what they want out of it, despite everything. So I think mission accomplished. What I think was certainly, and what I think was not too something that helped was that when this book came out, if you look at media appearances by Blake J. Harris, they look for Console Wars much different than they looked after the history of the future. I mean, everyone wanted to talk about Console Wars, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it certainly looked like a lot of those people dropped out after the history of the future. Like, I was able to find, I had no problem seeing your Fox News appearances, Fox News Business, a lot of independent outlets, but, you weren't exactly on CNN. But
no, you're totally right. I mean, look, here's the simplest way to put it. And I genuinely believe I am, and I genuinely try to be very humble, because like I spent the first half of this call talking about it, I spent, my entire 20s trading commodities. So I look at everyday writing as like a gift, and I know how lucky I am, and I know how much luck factored in. But the fact is that Console Wars is the all-time best-selling video game book by far. It sold over 100,000 copies, translated into a dozen languages or whatever. And like you said, it was covered by every single media outlet in the gaming and tech space, mainstream gaming and tech space. And the new book, there has been literally zero reviews of the book anywhere, let alone, not just tech and gaming, but there's not even like a Publishers Weekly or New York Times or anything. And and the book has been mentioned in VentureBeat. Actually, Dean Takahashi at VentureBeat did 2 articles, an interview with me, and he came to a book signing. But aside from that, there is nothing in the mainstream tech or gaming sites. And so, I'll leave it to your audience to decide why that is.
Right.
What's the difference between these 2 books? But it's definitely a little surprising to me. And then I will say, given that the final portion of the book focuses a lot on how the media got the Palmer situation wrong, I did not go into this with my eyes closed. I actually expected that, that I wasn't going to get the same reception as Console Wars, but what I expected was negative reactions from the media, or reactions, explaining why they believe that they still reported this accurately. What I didn't expect was nothing at all.
Right.
So that was definitely the big surprise. And the funny thing is, I think part of just look at you. You're basically saying regarding the Palmer situation that you're just an outside observer to this, and all you want to know is the truth. You don't really care about the political aspect one way or the other. You just want to actually know what happened.
Right.
And I believe that 90+% of people feel the exact same way as you. I know that I certainly do as a reader when it's not about subjects that I'm an expert in. And I don't think the media feels the same way. I think they feel compelled to deliver a very skewed partisan perspective. And this is all a long wind-up of saying that the book has not been covered by any of the mainstream tech or gaming press, but the book has sold better than Console Wars has to this point. So readers are still finding the book. In large part, I owe a debt of thanks to Glenn Beck, who is somebody that I never thought I would owe a thanks to for anything.
Right.
But I guess the point is, as long as it's getting to the people, and that's definitely a challenge because without coverage, it is hard to get it out to people who are unaware that the book is out there. But for people who are reading it, they are definitely spreading the word. They're buying it as gifts, and it's very odd to me because I think on the one hand, it says something that the media has not covered the book, and on the other hand, it says something that the book has sold better than the first book. So I guess as a writer, I should know what it says, and I unfortunately don't. But it's been an interesting experience to say the least, and I will say that I'm very happy with the book. As an author, I would love for everything I write to sell 1 million copies, but there is also just the creative artistic side, and I feel fully satisfied in the actual book that I produced. I feel like I did a ton of research. I feel like I was able to tell the story of the rise of Oculus and this great sort of how-to guide for any entrepreneur out there. And then it also does swerve into this whole political social media territory that we're talking about. And I'm really happy with how I was able to balance that, though it has obviously created a bit of a marketing challenge.
So this all begs the question, where do you go from here? What do you try to do after an experience like this?
Run away as far as possible. No.
Hide, yeah.
Yeah. No, the next, I'm going to write another book, and the next book that I'm going to write about has nothing to do with technology or gaming, which is, on the one hand, I feel like, that's a good thing because of the reception I got. But it's not like I am running away. I was always planning to write this book next. And like I said, it's really inspiring as an author that readers are still finding and buying the book, even without the media, the traditional media coverage. And so the next book I'm going to write is about the first 3 Americans to open a hotel in Tahiti back in the 1960s and sort of the Tahitian hotel empire that they built.
Huh.
So that's what I'll be doing. But I still do love, gaming stories, and I will be, looking to tell shorter form, still long form versions of stories. But I definitely don't want to step too far away from gaming because I love writing about gaming, and I think that not enough about gaming is being written, though it actually, I believe, has increased significantly in the 5 years since I wrote Console Wars, which is awesome.
And as a reader of gaming books, I can tell you we're happy to have you on our side, and I hope you do. I would read a book from you about other topics just because of how much I like the writing style, but I will also look forward to you returning for the next gaming project when it comes up.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Tell me where listeners can find you and follow along with your work and hopefully check out these books.
Sure. So I have a website, BlakeJHarris.com. That's all one word and just the letter J, BlakeJHarris.com. And the most important thing that you'll get there is excerpts from my books, because I always really want to make sure that if someone's going to buy a book and, invest $12 or $15 or whatever the books cost, that, you know what you're getting into. So there's excerpts on there. And then you can find me on Twitter at BlakeJHarrisNYC. And I'm pretty compulsive about responding to people. So if you have a question or if you have some negative things to say to me, whatever you've got, I'll probably respond to you, and I'll do so cheerfully. But yeah, Blake J. Harris NYC on Twitter.
And just for fun, go on Blake's website and look at his Tucker Carlson appearance, and just for a laugh, count the seconds that pass from the time he says he was a Clinton supporter to the end of the segment. I think it was about 5.
I've also had people start to say that, like, I'm speaking at an event and people said they're going to boycott the event if I'm allowed to speak there because I appeared on Glenn Beck and Tucker Carlson. And, like, one, that's just crazy to me because I am still a liberal. I also feel like I've unlike Tim Pool to a degree, I feel like I practice very non-confrontational journalism. Like, I don't like picking fights online or anything like that. And then 2, as we discussed, like, those are the only people who've been willing to have me. So after spending 3.5 years on a book, I'd be an idiot not to take advantage of the opportunity to speak to audiences that might be interested in this book. But I guess we live in very polarizing times, and so I appreciate you having me on your show to have an awesome conversation. Yeah, so I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it too. I think we are a lot alike. I happen to know that objectivity is the fastest way to make enemies on all sides.
This is true.
But this has been awesome and refreshing to see, and I'm a fan of your work, and I know that whatever you do next will be awesome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
All right. Talk to you soon, buddy.
Take care.
Hey, I want to thank Blake J. Harris again. I knew he was going to be awesome, and he did not disappoint. If you guys didn't know, this was the last show of Season 2. We will be back with Season 3 in September. More interviews, more cool things. I will be working on a book and a game during the summer. I hope you guys do some really cool projects too, and I hope you get in touch about what you're doing. I know I will be putting up all kinds of stuff throughout those months that we're off. I'll be active at patreon.com/CodeWritePlay, where we have a community of project-focused people who are learning things together, sharing ideas, and I'm basically making myself available to those patrons in any way that I can. We will be doing stuff on CodeWritePlay.com. You won't be hung out to dry if you're not in the Patreon group at all. Everything makes it to Code Right Play eventually. I want to thank all of you for listening this season. I want to thank the people who helped made the show possible. Tim Kitzrow did an amazing job recording our voiceovers for the intro while he was busy doing work for Rage 2, so that was incredible. Thank you to Time Raps on SoundCloud. Your music's awesome. I love having it part of the show. Thank you again for that. Basically, everybody who's been along for this journey, I appreciate you guys so much. I wouldn't have it any other way, so please come back for Season 3. I'll be around. Get in touch on Twitter, social media. Check out CodeWritePlay.com, and let's look forward to cool things ahead. Thank you so much again. You guys take care. Talk to you soon.